I'm new to New Jersey. I've only been here about 6 months. And so I may have a slightly different perspective. I probably don't know a lot of people in the room. I know a few of you from my past life. I come with a slightly different perspective, I think, on some of these issues. The last 9 years prior to coming to New Jersey, I was in the United Kingdom at London at Imperial College. So I was somewhat, not completely, but somewhat isolated from a lot of the policy discussions that had been occurring in Washington as well as in states over the last 9 years. Prior to that, I was in Washington at EPA and was quite involved with a lot of at least the initial reauthorization discussions and doing research on some of those issues. And my perspective is, what's interesting about coming back, and I'm glad to hear it's a critical moment, it's exciting, and hopefully to be involved with some of those issues. My perception, though, is that things, and I want people to correct me if I'm wrong, but I have a perception that things have changed over the last 9 years, that some of the things that we used to talk about in terms of how to deal with transportation, everything from thinking about land use planning, transit-oriented development, increased fuel efficiency, that these were kind of fringe ideas 10 years ago. And now they seem much more mainstream and actually part of the solution rather than just outside the sphere of what transportation has to worry about. So I certainly want to see a lot of discussion of these issues, hopefully in some of the in response to some of the panels, and see what people's viewpoint are and how we can really move forward on some of these, because it will be quite interesting to see how the new reauthorization plays out, and especially how all the issues with climate change, which I'll be talking about later in the session, how we can solve some of those problems, which are quite challenging. So thank you for being here, and I welcome everyone. I think it should be a great day.
Thank you, Tony and Bob. And now it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Anthony Coscia, who is the chairman of the board of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. Chairman Coscia was appointed chairman in April 2003. And as you know, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey operates some of the busiest and most important transportation links in the region. Ports, airports, bridges are just some of the infrastructure managed and maintained by the port's 9,000 employees. As chairman, Tony has broad oversight responsibility for the agency's various transportation businesses and its $5.9 billion annual capital and operating budget. Chairman Coscia is also tasked with the tremendous responsibilities of the largest urban renewal project in the United States, rebuilding Lower Manhattan from the devastation caused by September 11th. From February 1992 to March 2003, Mr. Coscia served as chairman of the New Jersey Economic Development Authority. In real life, Tony is a partner in the firm of Wendell, Marks, Lane, and Middendorf, one of New York's region's oldest firms, and holds a seat on his executive committee. Tony also serves as a trustee of the New Jersey Network Foundation, the New Jersey Community Development Corporation, and the Liberty Science Center Foundation, and is a member of the Partnership for New York City and the New Jersey Performing Arts Center Council of Trustees. I've known Tony only for a short period of time, maybe 5 to 6 years, and I was so pleased when he agreed to give this opening presentation today. In addition to his many professional accomplishments, he is also, as you know, a great guy. It is my pleasure to welcome Chairman Coscia to Princeton today. Tony, please.
Thank you, Rich, for that very gracious introduction. It is, in fact, a pleasure to be here because there are so many people who I consider friends and whose work I respect so deeply, Rich Keevy certainly being among them. And as Tony mentioned, my former partner, and I think we did a lot of good things together, and I often reflect on that, Tony Shuris, who served very, very capably as executive director of the Port Authority during his career, and did other stints there as well, and was a big part of why during the past decade that agency has confronted many of the challenges as opposed to avoiding them. And we all owe Tony a deep debt of gratitude for that. Bob, welcome to the New Jersey transportation discussion. Frankly, I think your perspective will be extremely valuable to us, and I'm very pleased that Rutgers sought to enlarge the discussion as opposed to narrowing it, which is always a very, very positive thing. I have to acknowledge Marty Robbins, who we all have looked up to in this field for so long and who has done so much work that we have all now benefited from, and there are countless numbers of projects and concepts that without Marty's diligence would not have come this far, and we're all very grateful for that. And then finally, I guess I wanted to also recognize, several other people, but I wanted to again point to how important the concept of a regional approach to what we do. We're here in New Jersey largely talking about issues that would affect this state, but having a sense of importance of how the region overall is affected by it. And Commissioner Glynn's presence here from New York is a demonstration of the true partnership that exists between two states who have come to understand that the geographic boundary that divides them means very little in the economic terms that we have to confront together and in a global economy that presents so many challenges. And I'm grateful, Commissioner, for your participation here today. And then finally, Mort Downey and Jack Basso are here, and again, in terms of using a public opportunity to express gratitude, these are two gentlemen who dedicated a very intense portion of their life recently to helping President Obama understand the issues that he needs to face in the transportation issue. Their leadership as part of his transition team is something that Secretary LaHood clearly is benefiting from, and the ability of this administration to begin its action very quickly and swiftly is in no small measure a function of the good work that they did in bringing the transition effort forward. And Jack and Mort, we're all very grateful for your hard work there. They have attempted to return to the ignominy of their normal day jobs, but unless they go into the witness protection program, I think it's unlikely that they'll escape that completely. And I'm sure the President and his closest advisors will call upon them often for good counsel and advice. It's interesting being here at Princeton for a couple of reasons, one of which I have to admit to you, in the sort of hecticness that we all operate and in the multitude of things that we do, certainly I know a fair amount about the work of Rich Keevy and this entity at Princeton, but part of me sort of walked in here today thinking that I might be speaking to a group of students. As I look up at the crowd and I see so many people who I know have impressive backgrounds in this field, I'm impressed and honored to be here among you speaking. But I have to say that if someone who is between 18 and 23 is the crowd that's in front of me, then Princeton does in fact work their students a bit harder than maybe they should. And I say that with all due respect. Having said that, you know, I'm also sort of reminded of one other sort of minor anecdote from my own life, which is that I had a professor in law school who basically would come to class every day and would spend a fair amount of time in terms of his own form of intel determining exactly which student really knew the least in the class. And as you know, law schools teach through the Socratic method, so it is not a lecture as much as it is an inquiry between the professor and the students. And so this particular professor would make it his business to determine who knew the least in the room, and that's the person who he would insist on doing the talking. I have unfortunate news for you, because that sort of is what's happened here as I look around the crowd, because I see so many of you who I know have dedicated so much of your time and energy to this issue, and frankly I am somewhat humbled that I'm the person here speaking as opposed to listening to some of you. Having said that, I will do my best to give you my sense of the region, the Port Authority's role in the region, and frankly the larger issue of how we deal with what you have heard already and you will hear throughout the day about the real underinvestment that has taken place in terms of our infrastructure, not just in the transportation sector, but really throughout it, although my focus is primarily, obviously, in the transportation area. The President, in his recent message to the joint session of the Congress, talked about the fact that we keep putting off critical decisions and critical debates. Certainly in many fields, but this field in particular, we have avoided the difficult questions. For all the reasons that have caused so many ills that we deal with today, we have not really stepped up to the challenge of those decisions and those discussions that require the kind of investments and the kind of forward thinking that we should have. Frankly, our predecessors did a much better job. In the first half of the 20th century, those who occupied our positions built the George Washington Bridge, built the Lincoln Tunnel and other major crossings. They built major airports. They built facilities that in fact created an economic backbone to this region, and the prosperity that we enjoyed in the years that followed it is in no small part the fact that this kind of connectivity, through the recognition that infrastructure creates an empowerment from an economic standpoint, is something that we all benefited from. And frankly, the New York region and the New Jersey region could not have enjoyed the kind of economic prosperity they did without that infrastructure put in place. But that infrastructure, of course, looked at needs that existed at the time. The advent of the automobile and what it meant to the mobility of Americans in so many different forums created the interstate highway system, created a series of connections that would allow people the kind of freedom, the kind of independence, the economic empowerment that the automobile created for people. And so when I look at those who actually were making these decisions 50 years ago and 60 years ago, they were both visionary, they had the stick-to-itiveness to begin projects that would take more than one election cycle, that would require significant amounts of resources, and they did those things. And for that, they saw the benefits of it. I have to say our track record, certainly in recent decades, is not as good. And in fact, you could say that we now have underinvested in those areas that are so critical, and the result of our underinvestment, the result of our unwillingness to look beyond short-term cycles, has resulted in traffic delays and airline delays and a whole variety of other inefficiencies that have a significant price tag. People talk about how expensive some of these projects are. I can tell you that there is substantial empirical data to show how expensive inaction is. The Partnership for New York City recently completed a study that showed that $2.6 billion a year is lost on airline delays. They're estimating between now and 2025, this region will lose nearly $80 billion of economic value based on the fact that people's airplanes do not take off and land when they're scheduled to. There's an enormous cost to that. We lose approximately $13 billion in value each year based on traffic delays. Frankly, having people sitting in traffic at the Lincoln Tunnel or the George Washington Bridge doesn't make anybody any money. It clearly has a huge economic cost to us. And I haven't even touched upon the enormous environmental aspects of that kind of a difficulty in our transportation system. So when we look at what we're doing, we have to look at not just the price tag of the proposals that are made, but the price tag of inaction, which I will tell you we have found to be substantial by any measure. But when we look at what we're going to build, the truth is that we have to take into account challenges that are unique to the decisions we're making today that policymakers perhaps in the prior period did not have to encounter. We expect that this region, which is among the most densely populated in the world and certainly in the United States, will see an additional 3 million people by 2030. Somehow that population increase has got to be accommodated from a transportation standpoint. Employers will need access to skilled and diverse workforces, which today are woefully inadequate. In addition to that, we're going to have to realize we're going to have to incorporate in everything that we do the effect of airborne pollutants in what we do and how that will affect the various transportation investments that we make. All of these are decisions that are very relevant today. Perhaps were not as relevant 50 or 60 years ago when people are making similar decisions, but they're part of what we do and what we need to do. We also need to consider things like energy independence. 54% of our oil comes from imported sources. Not all of these countries, it's no surprise, are our allies. So that has to be an issue in how we make these decisions and the considerations that we make. In addition to that, I believe strongly, and I think many policymakers do, that transportation is actually a vehicle through which we can provide equal opportunity from an economic standpoint. The ability to empower individuals where they live by giving them the kind of accessibility to employment opportunities is something that will have a material impact on so many levels of the economy, and that's something that we have to deal with when we make these decisions. So the question really comes down to, and I think Rich sort of framed it in a very similar context, what do we plan to build and how are we going to pay for it? because it really is as simple as those two questions. The first question, I have to say, and I think those two questions have, in my view, very differing levels of complexity. The first question I actually think is relatively simple, in the sense that we have to find a way to get people out of cars and onto buses and trains and mass transit systems and environmental and transportation alternatives that are far more consistent with what we understand to be the highest possible goals for efficiency, for environmental sustainability, and for overall quality of life issues. The Port Authority has gone through what I believe in its capital plan a substantial transformation. We have in our current capital plan $8 billion, a substantial amount, nearly a third of our entire capital plan is dedicated toward transportation projects that would be characterized as regional or mass transportation projects. The two most significant in that category is our $3 billion investment in the ARC Tunnel project, building a new tunnel under the Hudson River. Surprisingly, and I know there's probably no one in the audience who is not aware of the fact that we currently rely for heavy rail transit from New Jersey into Midtown on a tunnel that was built in 1910 by the Pennsylvania Railroad. It's got one track in and one track out, and I don't need to fill in the blanks as to all of the limitations that a system like that provides. This project, which has been in the planning stages for many, many years, is now in a position where it is ready to go, and I'm proud of the fact that the Port Authority has a $3 billion investment in that project, something that will take 22,000 cars a day off the road, eliminate 65,000 tons per year of greenhouse gas emissions, and double capacity into Manhattan. It creates an opportunity to create mass transit alternatives, not just between New York and New Jersey, but among different urban municipalities in New Jersey. It creates greater capacity on the New York side. It is, in fact, the kind of project that we should be moving forward with. I'm very grateful for Governor Corzine's leadership on this issue. In fact, yesterday the governor spoke of a $130 million deposit that the federal government has provided as part of the stimulus package, and it is our expectation that we will begin this project that has been a discussion piece in the coming months, and we're very, very optimistic and hopeful about the opportunity that that presents. Another investment in our capital plan is over a $3 billion investment in the PATH system. I'm sure all of you are familiar that this provides a vital aspect to the ability to link the two states together. Thousands of travelers use the system every day. We are at record numbers in the history of our undertaking of that system, and we are now very far along in a over $3 billion plan to replace every single PATH car. We expect the first cars to be delivered beginning this summer. We are renovating stations to provide significant additional platform capacity, and the overall effect of this program will be over a 20% increase in the capacity of the system. It is an existing mass transit system that has been underutilized and largely ignored. And in fact, the story in its underutilization and to some degree its marginalization is a good story about the transformation that I believe is taking place at the Port Authority. We acquired the PATH system as part of the deal between the states to build the original World Trade Center. In a very basic discussion of what's in it for us, New Jersey, the governor at the time, insisted on the Port Authority acquiring what was a defunct railroad that connected the two states. The Port Authority, I must admit, for a fairly substantial time of its ownership of that system, was not enthusiastic about the investment. As you would imagine, a self-sustaining entity like the Port Authority was not thrilled with the notion of taking on a mass transit investment for the simple reason that mass transit loses money. For an agency that had built an enormous financial capacity based on its ownership of transportation facilities that had revenue opportunities associated with it, adopting one that had to operate at an absolute subsidy was clearly an issue. And for a significant period of time, the underinvestment is in part attributable to an attitude that needed to change. I'm grateful and happy to say that that attitude has in fact changed, and our level of investment in the PATH system is, if nothing else, an indication of a recognition that to an agency whose job it is to move people around this region, doing it by adding another lane to Lincoln Tunnel isn't going to cut it. And so we are actually stepping up and making those investments that will put us in a position of having to financially strain, but will meet the mandate that we were put in business for in the first place. We're doing that, hopefully, in a manner that doesn't ignore the other businesses that are vital to what we do, although we're spending the dividends from the profitability of those other businesses in investing in mass transit. Airline travel is critical to this region, to a service economy that depends on people from around the world coming here and from people here going to various places. The 110 million people that we served at our major airports last year is a true indication of how connected our aviation industry is to the economic lifeblood of this region. And for that reason, we continue to invest very aggressively in the aviation system. We are building new terminals. We're building additional runway capacity. We have a very aggressive multi-$100-million flight delay program that has us making investments on the ground that we hope, with a cooperative federal partner, will help us alleviate some of the delays that we have at the airports, but will clearly create additional capacity for a region that is so heavily dependent still on air travel. In addition to that, as what I think is the most tangible effort of an agency that is willing to shed some of its older issues and come up with a way of dealing with present-day problems, we acquired last year Stewart Airport in Newburgh, New York. It is, in essence, the first major investment that the Port Authority has made in a new airport system in decades. And what is really amazing about the decision to do that is that Newburgh, New York, for those of you who do not know, is actually outside the jurisdiction of the Port Authority. We were willing to take the initiative of getting both governors and their support in the legislatures to essentially amend our legal ability to allow that to happen. That's how important it was, because we understood that in the congested airspace above the New York metropolitan area, building additional runway capacity at our existing airports without expanding that footprint and in capturing those areas where we could spread out the traffic more in order to alleviate the delays would not be effective, and we made those investments. We've also made continuing investments in the very business that we started in, which is the port commerce business. This economy, because it is so reliant on goods that come here from around the world, is very reliant on a goods movement system that is efficient. And in that regard, we've decided to put our money into intermodal systems that we believe are consistent with our efficiency and our sustainability goals. Our capital plan includes a $600 million investment in building an on-dock rail system that will take 1.5 million containers off of trucks and onto train tracks. That will produce an incredible benefit for the shippers whose economics are affected by it, and for the quality of life of those who are affected by the fact that we are pouring tons of trucks from our port facilities onto the same congested roadways that serve one of the most vibrant economic markets in the world. And that, I think, is the kind of investments that we need to make. But there is so much more to do, and certainly the issues associated with the PA are not unique. The underinvestment and the needs for additional investment in so many areas is true here, it's true throughout the country, which leads us to the issue of how do we pay for all of this? You know, the tendency we all have is to think that our problem is more severe than that of others, and frankly, I guess the definition of pain is what you feel, and the definition of the worst pain is clearly the pain that you feel. And I think that we all recognize that this is a national problem, but we focus on our own. But it is in fact true that there is a national issue associated with the underinvestment in transportation infrastructure that needs to be addressed. And I guess if I have one message that I'd like to share with you, because I think it's the most notable thing, is that my experience at the Port Authority and our willingness to change the way we look at our investment priorities and take those levels of risk that we think are necessary to fulfill our mandate has led me to conclude that the system that we have for paying for these types of improvements is just not adequate for our future needs. That there is, in fact, a need for us to devise a new system that will allow us to create ability to generate capital and to funnel capital toward investments that are necessary. We tend to take the models that were applicable in the past and try to apply them to the investments we need to do today, and I'll tell you that that has and continues to be inadequate on so many different areas. There are enormous pools of capital that need to somehow be channeled toward these kinds of investments. We need to find the next generation of financing mechanisms that allow us to make the kind of long-term, enormous investments that are necessary for the nation to be competitive based upon the fact that it does represent a state-of-the-art transportation system that will meet its 21st century needs. Now, in doing that, there's clearly enormous challenges. As I mentioned, those areas where I think we need investment the greatest are in the areas of mass transit, which also obviously are those areas where there are the least amount of revenue opportunities. But we have, in fact, in the past, confronted similar types of financing challenges. The the entire system of tax-exempt debt, the notion of a municipal debt market that in the United States, until the last several months, has been an enormously deep source of capital for government agencies in order to finance their projects, was in fact created during a period of similar economic decline, where people came up with a concept that would in fact revolutionize the way that financing took place. Clearly, we look at it now and we think, well, it makes all the sense in the world for the tax code to provide a preference to those who invest in projects that have a greater public benefit. I'll tell you, in the 1930s, it was not a very popular concept, and in fact required an enormous effort to ultimately become part of the tax law of this nation, and then was relied on for decades after that as the principal mechanism through which we finance things. Well, that similar kind of thinking outside the box is what we need to do now. We actually are blessed with planners and engineers and developers and construction entities who know what we need to build and know how to build it. We have got to figure out an equitable way of paying for it. There's been a lot of discussion on this subject in the whole area of public-private partnerships and how do we bring private capital into the realm of financing public infrastructure. There have been successes, clearly, in other parts of the world, in Europe and around the world, that people have pointed to and looked for opportunities to do that here. The track record in the United States is a lot more sporadic, obviously. And I think it's sporadic because we haven't really found the right balance to it. I think it is a very legitimate concern of those who are concerned about P3 investments to say that if in fact these are public assets operated for the public good, will it really work to superimpose on top of that a private sector ownership interest that will make decisions that are not necessarily in the public's interest? And that is a very legitimate issue. But it is also a legitimate issue to point to the fact that there are billions of dollars in equity funds around the world that could be deployed in the development of transportation infrastructure, and in fact trillions in the possession of government entities and sovereign wealth funds that could be repositioned toward long-term investments in transportation infrastructure if in fact we create the right mechanism for it. We have to be willing to find the balance. We have to be willing to see this issue as not a zero-sum game. It is not appropriate for us to look at the George Washington Bridge as either being owned by a public entity or by a private entity. There is a middle ground, there is a balance that has to come to that issue, and I don't know exactly what that is. I know that it has to have elements that create the right role for the broader level of capital that's available in the marketplace, but at the same time there has to be a priority to protecting the public's interest. In my view, the most promising vehicle through which to accomplish that balance, the most promising vehicle to achieve that kind of a result, is what the President talked about during his campaign in his National Infrastructure Bank. The President talked about creating an entity that has the ability to exercise the kind of judgment, the kind of oversight, the kind of broader view that will give us a vehicle through which we can channel capital in the right directions. We can make decisions about investment priorities, and we create a platform through which capital around the globe can be brought into these transactions to affect the kind of balance that I just spoke about. The President in his budget put $5 billion as essentially a statement that this is a concept he'd like to pursue. During the campaign, he talked about an entity that would in fact be run through a nonpartisan mechanism that would create a level of bringing together the people with the greatest level of knowledge to, on an interagency basis, determine what our best priorities are. Today, we do a lot of investing on the federal level in transportation projects, but we tend to do it in a bit of a silo mentality, in the sense that there are highway projects and there are airport projects and there are projects in various different areas. But the ability to compare them to each other certainly occurs, and the Congress is very much involved in that issue, as are people at the highest levels of the administration. But a mechanism which gives us the same kind of ability to affect fiscal policy in an intelligent way, where we can sort through the different priorities and come to conclusions, is something that we woefully need in this marketplace right now. Recently, as everyone has just sort of experienced, the President came to office with incredible issues confronting him literally as he walked in the door. And I applaud the administration for what it's done in terms of adopting a stimulus package that puts $800 billion of spending into the economy in an attempt to revive those aspects of it that are so sorely needed of additional liquidity at this point. But it was done in a way that was very fast, and the criticism, if any, of the stimulus package is that we had to make some decisions very quickly, and we had to do it in a manner where clearly most of it was done in investments that people had a consensus about, but there were definitely those areas where people had some questions about whether, in fact, those investments would produce the kind of benefit to the economy that the President sought. I believe that the administration did the right thing, it did it at the right time, and it acted in a way that was aggressive and needed by the economy. But it worked with the tools that it had. It came to office in a disjointed system that had multiple parties of interest, had to put together the largest spending plan in this nation's history with a level of information that was inadequate to make that decision. I think the job that they did was admirable under those extreme circumstances, but I think the next debate and the next discussion should be about creating a mechanism through which fiscal policy can be done in a very efficient manner that people in the future can rely on. The decisions that the President could have made had he had a mechanism like that in place would have clearly given him options that he probably did not have. Having said that, it will be a challenge to create some kind of a clearinghouse that allows for that kind of investment that takes all the different aspects into account. You know, when a concept that we think has real promise is announced and people talk about it in a very sort of skeletal way, we all tend to fill in the blanks with what we think is the right answer. And so I think there's a lot of discussion about this issue now among policymakers, and I think that's a very healthy thing. I personally think that a national infrastructure bank that has the ability to access capital markets in the United States and around the world, that will be the entity that becomes the safeguard of where capital from external sources can be invested and protect the preeminent interests of public authority over assets that serve a public purpose is a key part of it. It will also create a mechanism through which agencies throughout the United States, some of whom have more resources or fewer resources, could co-invest with each other in a way that creates the kind of partnerships, not just between public and private sector entities, but among public sector entities. And it will create a way where we can look at our investment priorities and step back and look at the entire picture and decide whether or not dollars are better spent in a mass transit project or a highway project or an airport project or various things that we're all considering and adopting as ways to resolve some of the roadblocks that we have today. It is a revolutionary concept and would clearly run up against many sacred cows that have been part of how we decide to spend money on a national level, but I think it is worthwhile. There is a Federal Reserve Bank that affects monetary policy, and the truth is that, for better or for worse, it creates a vehicle through which we can understand the money supply and we can modulate it based on how the economy evolves. We do not have a mechanism that has a similar impact on a broader sense in the economy that allows a president to affect fiscal policy in the same kind of coherent, intelligent way. I think it's about time we actually come up with that mechanism and support it. In closing, let me say that the challenges that we have obviously also represent an opportunity. I know the phrase today that's overused is never to waste a crisis, but the truth is that the discussions I've had recently with people at senior government and policy decisions about concepts that we really ought to be exploring were in many ways concepts that we've talked about for several years, but there just wasn't the desire to do it. This is an opportunity for us to reverse that trend, and hopefully people at all levels will see that and seize that opportunity. So I thank you for listening, and Rich, I think we have time for some questions. Thank you. Yes, sir.
I fly a lot. I fly 65,000 miles out of Newark. Recently, I'm actually starting to drive down to Philadelphia because the congestion is actually a lot less down there. And I'm wondering, you talked about you recognized this, and you also talked about new ways of investing, finding ways to pay for investments. Did you all come out against the auction of slots, and why did you? You probably have a good reason.
We did. We did come out in opposition to several programs that the FAA had proposed during the last administration that essentially were what we saw as capacity limiting decisions. the reason for it. Let me begin by acknowledging the fact that it is clearly a problem that our airports are as congested as they are. It is a congestion largely caused by the desire of people to come into and out of what is the largest origin and destination market in the world, but the congestion nonetheless has a huge price tag associated with it. The solution, however, we think is expanding capacity as opposed to constricting it. The federal approach, the federal proposal was a proposal that we believed would have, over time, restricted the number of people who could fly in or out of the New York metropolitan region. And since we're so dependent on that number growing as opposed to that number shrinking, that the long-term economic impact of solving the national aviation congestion problem by limiting the number of people who could fly in or out of New York City would actually ultimately have a very, very negative effect on the New York economy. In many ways, greater than the effect that the delays currently cause. But even more than that, and this was really the principal basis for our objection, it was, we viewed as a relatively oversimplified solution to a very complicated problem. The reason why we don't have additional capacity in the air system, we believe, is largely a function of an antiquated air traffic control system. I talked about the investments that we weigh. The aviation business is basically a partnership of three parties. There are the people who own the airports, like us. There are the people who operate the airlines, the airline companies themselves, and there's the FAA, who controls the airspace above the United States. The air traffic control system in place in the United States is essentially a ground-based radar system that was developed and designed in the early 1960s and we continue to use. It is an embarrassment that this is what we essentially fly, a system that has such an enormous impact on the national economy. We have been proposing an aggressive level of investment by the FAA and the federal government and replacing that system with a system that is a satellite-based system that takes advantage of modern technologies that allow for far more efficiency in the airspace. We believe that that kind of investment would create substantial capacity. We believe it so deeply that we have invested hundreds of millions of dollars of our own money for those improvements on the ground that we believe would ultimately accommodate that additional capacity. But that partnership with the federal government is necessary to do that. Auctions and limiting capacity, although they might provide some measure of short-term relief, would ultimately, we think, have a very negative impact on the regional economy.
Hi, Richard Arena, Association for Public Transportation. It's very good to hear the Port Authority's commitment to the ARC project. God knows 100-year-old tunnels need to be backed up. Only question is that the tunnels are actually coming in 175 feet under Penn Station. And as a result, they really can't be used to back up the existing Northeast Corridor. So if anything happens to those tunnels, Amtrak can't use them and the Northeast Corridor is split in half. The question I have is a situation like that where these tunnels don't come into Penn Station, is that really in the best interests of the region?
There are lots of issues associated with trying to advance a project that has so many conflicting needs that it has to accommodate. And in a perfect world where all options were available, the design of that project would incorporate not only greater connectivity to Penn Station, but would also incorporate connectivity to the east side of Manhattan. Proposals that the Regional Plan Association and others advanced earlier in the planning process called for not just a better integration to Penn Station, but also having the tunnels continue on to allow access of New Jersey residents all the way to Grand Central. I don't think there is anyone in this discussion who disagrees that those elements of the project would create a better project than the one that is currently planning to be built. But there are limitations from both a practical standpoint, given the engineering of the project and what's possible in the year 2009 in terms of construction options, and also financial resources. At some point, it was necessary for New Jersey Transit to make certain decisions about what could be done with the project that from a practical standpoint could be developed. The depth of the tunnel is entirely created as a result of other transportation systems that exist in New York, the New York subway system, water tunnels, the ability to build the tunnel by doing a tunneling project below grade as opposed to a cut and cover project, which in 1910 was an option, but in 2009 is far less of an option. So the decisions that were made that we believe add an enormous amount of transportation capacity, but not as much as would be the case if we were to address those two issues, was a decision that we made relative to the resources available today and the ability to do the project today. We do believe that the tunnel will provide significant additional capacity for the Northeast Corridor if for no other reason New Jersey Transit, which is a principal user of those facilities, will in fact now have an alternative. So the congestion that we alleviate would allow that to happen. I also believe there are design features that would allow Amtrak trains on the New Jersey side to be able to switch to ultimately use that. They would not be serving the normal platforms that they do at Penn Station, but in the event of an emergency, I think that would be possible.
It's heartening to hear you talk about Connie O'Day from Princeton, citizen involved in these issues. It's heartening to hear you talk about the thinking outside of the box and new solutions for the 21st century. And dealing with all these pressures, and we have to remember that transportation projects go through communities, which in the old colonial states, and especially New Jersey, are pretty tightly compacted, and many of which are precious historical communities. How are you keeping this consideration, the effect of transportation projects on these local communities, on the table as you try to deal with all these other effects? For example, you talk about getting people out of cars and into mass transportation, but in fact, we find that the effect of trucks on the communities is much greater than the effect of cars. Could you elaborate perhaps on
I'm sorry, the effect of what?
The effect of cars on the small roads in the communities is much less deleterious than the effect of the large trucks transporting the goods.
Thank you.
Do you anticipate that the greater use of trains will affect that, or is this something that still has to be thought through? Is this something you're thinking about?
Well, I'm going to break down my answer to your question into two pieces, because I think you're asking about two things, both of which I think are very good points as part of this discussion. The first point is that Robert Moses, although an impressive figure, and history has given him sort of mixed reviews, although clearly he gets credit for getting a lot of things accomplished, that sort of way of accomplishing major projects is not only no longer possible, but I think generally people believe not the right way to do things. Incorporating the community in a decision made relative to a major project that affects the community is not only the right thing to do, it is the only practical way to accomplish it. In an environment where people are very outspoken and where you need to build a consensus in order to get people to raise the kind of enormous amounts of money we're talking about to do it, it is important that whoever is advocating the project make a case to those directly affected by it that this is in fact a good thing, will help their lives, will make things better. And if they fail to make that case, they'll never build enough of a consensus to do anything of any real consequence. And I don't view that as a bad thing. I view it as a sort of regulator that stops us from having an idea where we can't really convince those affected by it that it's really a good idea, and as a consequence, we've got to work that much harder at refining the idea and improving it. This gentleman had some very good comments about the ARC project, all things that were discussed at length in community forums about the project, some of which we're able to accommodate and some of which we can't, but that discussion clearly makes a better project. Everything that we are doing at the PA now, all of the major projects we're involved in, there is a component of it that involves substantial community involvement. We have opened up our process as much as we possibly can to seek out those who are affected by everything we do and get their viewpoint. I can't tell you we always make them happy, and I can't tell you that we're able to create a consensus that is complete, but clearly we are flushing out those issues as much as possible and not simply running projects through people's neighborhoods and communities without taking those considerations into effect. And I think we've done much, much better of that. The ARC project, for example, we're going through a variety of community boards now to explain what we're doing, to get input on it. All of that was part of our approval process. So in regard to the major projects that we do and recognizing the unique needs of the communities who are affected by it, I think we have begun and are doing a very substantial amount to try to incorporate that viewpoint before projects get too far down the design road. The second issue, which you specifically mentioned, is the issue of trucks on the road, which is an enormous issue in New Jersey because of the fact that New Jersey provides such a link to the whole goods distribution network. And in that regard, I mentioned that we are looking for intermodal approaches to be able to use more efficient means. Now, freight rail is a solution to that problem in many ways, but freight rail lines also run through communities. So there is a balance that we have to reach between our desire to make investments that take trucks off the road and create more efficient mechanisms to distribute those goods, and then the other communities that are affected by it. Another thing that we're looking at is using waterborne ways of moving freight around, because that also is another option that takes trucks off the roads, is less intrusive to certain communities. Many of the components of this region are in fact connected by waterways. They're not waterways that are in each case adequate for movement of freight, but there are investments we can make to make them more adaptable to that. So we're looking at that as well. The goods distribution issue is something that does have to be approached on an interagency level that involves both states, multiple agencies, to take a look at a better way of moving goods around the region than simply throwing them on the back of a truck. But that, is certainly a work in progress.
I think that's it.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony.